It's back to school time as people return to their desks after the summer break. During the last couple of months, the atmosphere has taken a turn to the dark side. UK politics is now in a state of desperation. I think that's the best way of describing that. The major EU economies are flirting with recession. We've seen a negative number, of course, in the last quarter in Germany. There are record low yields on the US 30-year with an inverted US yield curve, the 2 to 10s. And traders are buying bonds like the doors are about to close on the market. Sean Corrigan joins us now from Cantillon Consulting. Wow, yeah. We're talking lots of positivity here. What's the biggest risk in your mind to the market?
The politics is clearly the background issue with all of this, and the question of the escalation of the Chinese issue, Brexit, you've touched upon.
I didn't mention China, of course.
Okay, well. But it's there in the background, isn't it? I think the immediate thing is how do we resolve this dilemma in the bond market? Because the fall in bond yields has all sorts of negative things, and in the fringes, I think we discussed this the last time I was here, central banks are quietly coming to the conclusion that maybe they can't continue, although of course they will now that the short-term imperatives seem to be mounting again. But the problem here is that the higher bonds go, the more people have to buy them, particularly people who have regulation, prudential constraints, insurance, pension funds. And pension fund companies, particularly defined benefit pension fund companies, are in a horrible vice because their assets may be going up with the stock market and indeed with the rise in bond prices, but then they have to discount all their liabilities, all the promises of pensions paid out in the next 30, 40 years back using a long-term interest rate, which is now at zero or below zero. So the liability side has exploded. And you can do a simple calculation using stock prices and bond yields and get a very nice, good, tight correlation with how surpluses and deficits in defined benefit pensions calculate in the States and in Britain, same model, same results, and the plunge in bond yields could add several $100 billion of notional losses to their pension calculations. Now, these aren't cash losses. It's not money going out the door of the company, but the company does have to say that the pension scheme is viable, and obviously not just corporations themselves, but the bigger financial institutions who run these things have to say to their regulators and their trustees, yes, this is actually a viable pension fund. So even if it is only an accounting loss, at some point they have to make it up. So that's money they're taking from productive use. So again, this whole issue of stimulus from low interest rates has run into another paradox by which it's anything but a stimulus.
So what do governments and central banks do about this? From what you say, it's at the moment, at least, if it's a defined pension scheme, let's say for company ABC, they've got to adjust it in the short term. But is there anything that can be done in the big picture, fiscally or monetarily, from central banks or governments to help out this?
This, of course, is the big worry, is that central banks are supposed to be independent, so they do not finance government deficit spending and thereby perpetuate inflation and all the other distortions that go on in the economy when government's too big. This is why they became independent, were granted this independence in the 80s and through the 90s. Now the independent central banks are starting to plead with the governments to use the cheap cash they're getting to go and spend money because they can't find anybody else to spend it because the policy has run its course, but there's no natural or painless death for it. There's no simple euthanasia to this situation. So the central banks, as we know, as we're chasing the recession down, the bond market is there because they think the central bank will react to the weakness, and the central bank is looking at the bond market and thinking it's telling them there's weakness, and so we're going to get another round of stimulus almost definitely. But the central banks are now also saying to the government, come on, spend money, hand over fist, here you go, it doesn't cost anything, build a bridge, build a road, give some welfare. So we're just re-socialising the economy. We're turning it back to the dirigist, state-run, commanding heights mess that we got into in the late 60s and early 70s.
So let's take the eurozone from this change of governance. We've got a new ECB chief coming in. What is she going to inherit?
Well, she's going to inherit Mario Draghi's mess, where the banks are.
Is it really his mess? I mean, how much of this is really down to him, and how much of it is circumstances? And he's just had to contain the situation over the last decade.
Well, okay, so it's the institutional failure of the ECB stroke the European Union. The ECB, if we want to go right back to the beginning, was arguably too lax when it first started because it wanted the project to be launched with a boom. It sat by while we exploded into the 2008 crisis. crisis and watched all the German, Irish, Spanish, whoever banks doing crazy things and didn't do anything. And then it's been firefighting ever since. But of course, the firefighting has left the dead wood and the dead trees and the destroyed buildings smouldering away and hasn't allowed enough to grow up in the spaces between them. So European banks are on life support. Pension provision must be horrible. Government deficits, for all the austerity, haven't really improved all that much, certainly not if you look through the cycles and the structural levels of it. And so we've perpetuated the problem. Draghi's been forthright in it because Draghi's mission, of course, is not really whether they deliver 2% inflation. It's whether he can hold the European Union together and prevent Italy from imploding. So it is, to that extent, his problem. Lagarde has already come in. She has no real expertise in this area. She's a political appointee, pure and simple. She's a federalist. She's a globalist. She's already started talking about let's change all the rules and regulations so that we can have Eurobonds and all these other things, which aren't really part of her mandate as a central banker.
Let me just quickly take a look in two areas of this. First of all, the European Central Bank, of course, has control over the eurozone, not the European Union. The UK government is in this dreadful situation now where it looks like there could be some sort of really big, desperate move within British politics, but the whole move there is to get them out of the European Union. Is it better, do you think, to be outside the EU with all this going on with the eurozone, or do you still think that it's, with this idea about globalism and the fact we can all fight things better together, do you think it's better that the UK does actually stay in? I know you're not a political analyst and perhaps maybe aren't allowed to give an opinion, but it's an interesting situation the UK is in at the moment.
Well, undoubtedly there'll be disruption, there'll be short-term pain, and there's lots of scope for political mischief or stupidity. But Britain is tied into a structure which is patently flagging. I mean, even Germany now is losing momentum. Germany's losing its way. It's losing its internal political coherence. Its manufacturing industry is in all sorts of problems with trade wars, car bans, this, that and the other. Can Britain really do any worse outside it, as long as it takes the opportunity to elect its own sensible government with its own sensible programme? But being bound to the European Union, which, again, the flight to the centre is all they have to offer. It's more big government spending, it's more federalism, it's less democratic choice, it's more big grandiose projects, passing money from a rich region to a poor region to try and keep everybody in the same bucket. Is Britain going to do well under those circumstances? Is it going to do worse than it would if it came out and tried to fight on its own, stand on its own 2 feet, as it always has done?
So what's priced in? Let's take a look at sterling against the US dollar. 121. I was talking to an economist last week. I won't say who it was, but we were talking on air about this, and we were talking about a no-deal Brexit situation. He said 110 easily. It's currently 121. Could go to parity in the worst-case scenario. Are you saying that perhaps maybe it's not as bleak as that?
Well, sterling could come under pressure, and of course the forces who would like to paint the political situation as catastrophically as possible wouldn't be the first time that they started manipulating the currency to cause a scare. Run on sterling is a classic political I mean, you know, let's go back. President Eisenhower instituted one to stop Britain in Suez. So that could happen anyway. But the question is, when we get down here, let's assume there is a no deal, there's disruption, there's chaos for a while, there's bad headlines everywhere, but then people know where they are and they start reacting. Sterling is already pretty much historically cheap. At some point, the rest of the world are going to say, here we have one of the world's biggest economies where everything's being sold at a discount. Now, again, assuming that domestic politics doesn't take a horrible turn, we don't get a McDonald Marxist government confiscating everything out of this or whatever, I can't see why foreign investors will, if they're already talking about trying to buy Argentina because it's slumped and it's going to recover, why would they not buy sterling? So yes, sterling goes down, but how long does it stay there? Because I think people around the world will be looking for assets. And they'd be looking for assets in Britain, in what is still a relatively successful major force in the economic world.
Yeah. Just one final thing. Along with the European Central Bank, which got a meeting, I think, on the 12th of September, the Fed on the 18th, we're looking there at possible interest rate cuts. What's going through the mind of Mark Carney and the Bank of England, do you think, at the moment?
Well, I think Mark Carney's just thinking about his next job, isn't he? That's why he came out with this ludicrous sub-Keynes speech at the G7 meeting. I don't know. I mean, the Bank of England through all this process has tended to make it worse. Whenever there's been some upset, they've cut rates or they've introduced stimulus. And I remember saying straight after Brexit that Carney was driving capital flight to the airport in a limousine because that was his whole thing. Well, this is going to cause some disruption, so rates must be lower. Well, not necessarily. You don't want to make it easy for people to sell the currency short by providing them with a limitless or a cheap supply of it. So I don't know. I mean, the Bank of England should really sit back because to the point this isn't threatening financial stability, this is a shock outside of their mandate, and they should just sit and wait to see how the pieces come and see what business does in the aftermath and just, okay, make some soothing noises, but let's see how business picks up. It could be it's the biggest revival we have. Business go 3 years, we haven't known what to do, and okay, the price of everything has gone up, the customs forms are now 3 times as long, but now we know what we're doing. It could be a boom, who knows?
Yeah, okay, well, we'll leave it there, but Sean, thanks indeed for taking us on our regular tour of the macroeconomics from the view of Sean Corrigan at Cantillon Consulting.